And so it's really important that there are people out there who are bought into the ideology and say, yeah, I get value, not necessarily from a small royalty check, but rather I get value from being able to access and use other people's resources. And then at the same time, I am also going to contribute to that landscape. And we choose to receive payment, at least partially, through that community and contributing to it.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, Dr. Christian Hilchey, lecturer in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, talks about open educational resources and how teachers can find and even create their own open media. Christian and I talk about the many resources available to potential content creators in language learning. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Christian.
Hello. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I wondered if we could begin with just having you give a little bit of background, what you've been working on, where you come from.
So I am an instructor of Czech, and I have been teaching Czech for a little over, looks like, 13 years now. And I have been teaching at a number of different universities, the University of Chicago, Indiana University, and now here at UT Austin. My background is actually in linguistics, and I got my degree from the University of Chicago in Slavic linguistics. And immediately upon, I always had a strong interest in creating various types of language resources, but immediately upon starting my position here at UT Austin, I began work on an open textbook of Czech, and that would be one that would not only be under an open license. It's under a Creative Commons license, which allows me to publish the materials and gives anybody the ability to use those materials, copy parts of it, as long as they give me attribution, and in the case of our particular project, as long as they share the resources or any derivative products that they create as well. The name of the project is Reality Check, and it's just been a really fun ride.
Excellent. Well, open resources are, I'm actually a huge advocate of open source software. We understand the value of open media. Why are they important, particularly for language learning or linguistics?
We also want to think in terms of language resources, of unlocking that content. So many times we have very expensive textbooks. I just look in the case of Czech, the major textbooks that are available can be over $100. One of the textbooks that we were using for quite a long time was $180 for students for the year, and especially for a less commonly taught language like Czech, that can be a real impediment for students who are maybe interested in taking the class. And then that content, sometimes gradually, sometimes very quickly, gets outdated. The textbook, for example, that we use for a long time still mentions Bill Clinton as the president.
Wow.
Which is obviously just a testament to how out of date it was. So I think, and just kind of speaking more broadly, this use of open resources, this is not something that just is involved in the creation of textbooks, but we have things like Wikipedia. So the dissemination of information without any sorts of restrictions on it. We have different resources that allow people, or different sites that allow people to share photos that they create, or drawings, or things like this, and all of these enable content creators like myself or other people to create content that would otherwise be, that creative process that would be unattainable for almost anybody. On a daily basis, I search through dozens, or I utilize dozens of images in my textbook, and so it's really important that there are people out there who have bought in to this ideology, and I'm one of those people,
Right.
bought into the ideology and say, yeah, I get value not necessarily from a small royalty check, but rather I get value from being able to access and use other people's resources, and then at the same time, I am also going to contribute to that landscape. And so it's we all can sort of choose to receive payment in one way or another, and we choose to receive payment at least partially through that community and contributing to it.
I imagine that the cost of entry into becoming a content creator as an instructor, the cost is less and less. Do you think it's realistic that instructors could develop their own open source material and become content creators?
I do, and I think it's actually really important to stress that when we think of content, we're so used to thinking of the kind of content that gets packaged into a textbook. And when you think about textbooks, you're thinking about major textbook publishers, and then so you're really thinking about the possibility of there being more than a small handful of textbooks out there. It's unrealistic for there to be that many different textbooks and for them to be commercially viable. But if we think about, on the other hand, small resources, the kind of resources that I think all language instructors to a certain extent create. I mean, probably I don't know a language instructor who has not written their own test or who has not created their own activity.
Absolutely.
So we've all done these things.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, without much altering of these things we created, those could become open resources. And I think if we see the benefit of sharing those, and that other people will also buy in and share their own resources, and so we have this sort of flow in both directions or multiple directions, we'll actually see we'll reap a lot of benefits from that.
Sure. Well, with your project, Reality Check, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it in terms of what you've learned regarding, say, best practices in developing open resources.
Sure. And so I have unfortunately not been able to utilize a lot of materials that were, there are a number of websites, Merlot, OER Commons, where instructors can go and search for materials that are created for their specific language. And so if you teach French, you can find a number of resources that are for French instructors, for French classrooms or Spanish, etc. There's not a large, there's not even a small amount of resources available for Czech. And so what I was forced to do is essentially build from the ground up. But so in terms of that, the kinds of best practices that I would like to share is in terms of how do you find the good stuff? How do you find good images? How do you find good video that can be utilized in whatever kind of materials, whether it's your textbook or whether it's your small assignment, your activity, or whatever you're creating. There are a number of websites out there that offer free images. So, for example, Pixabay is a really commonly used website where they offer a lot of public domain images. Flickr is a photo sharing website where people can put their photos under a number of licenses, whether it's I retain all the copyright to my photo to I put this photo in the public domain, or any of a number of Creative Commons licenses. So the Creative Commons license is the most commonly used license used by creators of open content such as this. And there is the sort of most open license, which basically says as long as you cite me, then you can use these materials. And then there's other stipulations that can be put on there, such as long as you cite me, and then anything you create from this it must be shared under similar terms. That's known as the attribution share-alike license. And there's other stipulations: non-commercial use, don't alter my work. All these sort of things come into the equation. But so there's things like Flickr. There's also Wikimedia Commons. And so it's really been about looking, sort of really learning where I can access a lot of great material, and then how best to search for that material. Just today, for example, I'm working on a unit that has to do with injuries. Being able to talk about, for example, my head hurts,
right,
or I have a broken arm. And I like to mediate as much as possible in terms of having photos or images or drawings with as many example sentences or with as many activities as possible. And you'd be surprised, actually, the kinds of ways that you have to search for somebody who's got a headache. You don't necessarily search for headache.
Right.
All sorts of phrases: my head hurts, head hurts, holding head, these sorts of things. And so these kinds of practices you kind of learn as you go. How do you find that kind of media that's going to best sort of play that supporting role for the content that you're trying to create? Same thing goes with video in terms of I struggled for a while to find really great video content. And then my talk, I touched on this, I discussed this pretty extensively in terms of looking at various keywords or using various keywords to look for content, such as vlogs or time lapse, or haul or various things like that help you to find content that is oftentimes hidden, but it's out there and there's a lot of it.
I see. Yeah. In your talk, you mentioned the option of editing open source materials to better integrate them into a course. First of all, I wonder if you could share with our listeners how they might do that themselves.
So editing. And I do a lot of both photo editing and video editing as well. And this can seem, I think, really daunting to we're language educators, not people who, generally speaking, have to edit those kinds of materials. I think now, though, there are a lot of resources that allow us to do quick editing with very little experience. For example, I create a lot of memes in my course. Students really tend to enjoy them.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
And and one of the great things about memes is, well, you have to use a photo, and so I of course go find photos that I can legally edit.
Yeah.
And so now you can create a meme using a complex photo editor, something like Photoshop. But to create those effects actually takes quite a bit of time. The shadow effects and things like that. But now there are dozens of meme creators online, and you really just have to Google meme generator, and you can find whichever one really suits. They all essentially do more or less the same thing.
Right.
I try to find one that doesn't leave a big watermark on my image. But otherwise, so that kind of simple editing. Most of my, I do some more complex editing in a Photoshop-like program. Actually, I use an open source.
I was just going to say, probably open source.
It's called. It's not the most PC name for a program. It's called the GIMP.
Oh yeah. I've used GIMP before, sure.
Yeah, and it's a great image open source image editing image editing software. I love it. And I've used that quite a bit, but the learning curve's high. And I still, for almost anything that I need to do, I have to sort of Google it, watch a YouTube video, and things like that. But most of my day-to-day editing, and by that I mean cropping photos, or sometimes overlaying a graphic on top of another photo, is done within Google Docs. And the great thing about Google Docs or the Google Docs suite is that it makes it really easy for for almost anybody. It's just quick clicking and dragging and dropping.
Right.
And in fact, actually, all of my work, the entirety of the project is written in Google Docs. And so whenever people access any of our content, it actually is coming straight from a Google Doc. Our website is actually all of the content is drawn from Google Docs, which also makes editing documents on the fly, even using my phone. I've literally gotten an email from a student saying, "Hey, this doesn't make sense," and I realized there was, I copied and pasted something wrong, or I forgot to say doesn't or instead of does, or something simple like that, and so I can be sitting, on the bus, and I can edit those kinds of documents really quickly, and so there's a lot of power for the individual user now to be able to edit, whether it's documents or images or video, very quickly, without a whole ton of experience in that area.
Well, in terms of audio or video, I would think you could very quickly get into a situation where you've changed the material so extensively that it's unrecognizable, or something we've done quite a bit at the LRC is maybe segment a piece of audio or video into much smaller pieces and integrate that into some sort of web app or something. So I imagine there's a level of license where that becomes impossible.
Yeah. So there's Creative Commons has one. There's over a half dozen variants on the Creative Commons license, and one of the variants is the no derivative works.
Right.
And so it's often symbolized by an equal sign next to the other Creative Commons logos. And what that means is you're more than free to use my work, but you're not allowed to alter it in any way. You can't Photoshop it, or you can't cut a clip from my video or from the audio. In those kinds of cases, you're really limited to just using that piece of media as it is. And so you have to really make that decision. Is it good as is? And a lot of times it is. I've only really run into that in terms of photos, thankfully. Right. So either it depicts what I want it to depict, or it doesn't. But otherwise, I haven't really run into that too much in terms of video or audio. Yeah. I've run into other unfortunate stipulations on audio.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, I'll give you an example, and I love this resource. It's Forvo, and it's forvo.com. You can access it. And what's great about Forvo, all the content is under a Creative Commons license, but the license is a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial share alike. And share alike says if you use this resource, you have to share everything that you create under the same license. Forvo is an audio recording website / database where you can type in a word in virtually any language, and you can get native speaker recordings of that word. And you can imagine how powerful that would be for creating a language textbook.
Oh, that's very cool.
And in fact, if you type in a word, sometimes you'll not only get a word, but you'll get phrases. So you might not only get a recording of cloudy, if you looked up the word cloudy, but you might also find somebody recording their voice saying, "It's cloudy outside," or "I hate it when it's cloudy." And so you get a lot of that on there. Unfortunately, I started to use these only when I realized I actually don't have the rights to use these, because if I use these, I have to license my entire project under this non-commercial license, which would be fine, but then I can't combine it with other things that are that in some way conflict with that non-commercial license. So it's a real mixed bag in terms of how can I use this content? And so it's trying to fit it together. Unfortunately for Forvo, it's a great resource for instructors, but we can't necessarily integrate it into larger projects like my own. You'd have to maybe create some sort of smaller, project just based around pronunciation, and then license it under their same terms.
Yeah, interesting. Huh? Yeah, I guess you can't have it all, but
in terms of editing, editing things, there are times where you do have to focus on the license and what it allows you to do. I tend to, for that reason, like to stick to the most basic of the licenses, either a public domain work or just one that is attribution or share alike, and then after that, I try to, it becomes a lot more difficult.
I see. Wow, that's very helpful information.
Yeah, and it also probably makes it sound a lot more complicated than it is. The good thing is the content that I'm talking about represents a small minority of the content out there. Most of the content that you're going to run into, and in fact, for example, if you've gone onto Wikipedia and you've used any of the images, or if you've liked any of the images you see, well, thankfully, most of them, there is only, I believe, 3 licenses that Wikipedia allows for its content to be licensed under, either a public domain, an attribution, or an attribution share alike license. So you don't really run into some of these other issues of incompatible licenses on there.
Interesting. Well, look, Christian, before I let you go, I wonder if you might have any advice for instructors who want to share materials that they themselves have created.
Sure. So I would, in terms of a resource like ours, I work with the Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning, that's CORAL, here at the University of Texas in Austin. And centers like that will often have a number of different projects that they publish on their website. And so they become sort of a hub for the projects that they are associated with. But for an individual instructor who maybe has created something and they want to share that with a broader audience, I would recommend maybe looking at OER Commons. That's oercommons.org. And it's a place where instructors can go and post their own content. They can also create their own content. They have an editor on there where you can put your content in and format it the way that you want to, etc. There are a number of other ones like Merlot. So I would recommend that you maybe start with one of those as a method for publishing your content. Additionally, here at the University of Texas, we also have the Flight Project. Flight stands for Foreign Languages and the Literary and the Everyday, and it's its own specific approach to language pedagogy. But if it's a lesson that is compatible with the Flight approach, then it's possible to actually submit it here and get it peer reviewed. And then published through us, or rather through the Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning. But actually, just more broadly speaking, I would just recommend that any instructor who's interested in creating something that they be maybe willing to share it and see how that they can benefit from what's out there, and that others can benefit from their work. This is something that I really strongly believe in after having been doing it for the past 4.5 years, and I hope more instructors will get on board with these types of projects.
Well, it's very important work, I think, and we're all grateful that you're spreading the word about it. And you've got all sorts of resources for us, so we will supply links to all of those resources in the description of this podcast. And Christian, I want to just thank you so much for being on Speaking of Language.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Next week, Angelica is back from Actville.